Hello, thank you for joining us today as we dig into the Word of Yah. You will be listening to a Restoration Fellowship teaching brought to you by Hebrew Nation Radio. These teachings are offered freely to our listeners, although this is only made possible by your continual support and contributions to this wonderful ministry. Through the internet, we are able to reach people across the world and share the Hebraic perspective on our Messiah and the living Word. So please, consider giving from your heart today. Thank you for listening, and may you be abundantly blessed.
Wonderful. How many of you enjoyed it so far? Amen. Think this is just a taste of what's to come. Every week when we celebrate this and we have this awesome fellowship together and with Him, it's just a rehearsal for the Sabbath millennium. So just think about that, how nice this is. It's unthinkable of how awesome it's going to be when you get to do this every day when He rules and reigns on earth. Amen? I really want to tell Daniel, just thank you for last night's, what you shared, because it's really a perfect segue into what we're going to share today. Because whenever an individual is willing to get up and deliver a message like that, they had to hear from Yahweh. Because it's not popular. It's not something you want to do. It's usually something you're looking at them, are you sure? Do I really have to do this? The prophets weren't popular. In fact, a lot of them didn't end too well because the people most times didn't want to hear a word that was a word of correction. But yet we find we often look at the individual and we can dismiss it if we can say it's coming from just the person. But if we really listen, we know who it's really coming from, and it's coming from Yahweh. And it's a lot harder to ignore Him. Because He has a way of getting our attention, doesn't He? He lets you know when He wants you to listen. And He makes sure your ears are tuned in. And really, that's exactly what this Torah portion does. If you've read it, you know that this is a very significant Torah portion. And it's a word of correction. And it's not just for the generation that was in the wilderness, because they sealed their fate. They made their choice. But this Torah portion is for you and I. Because in the days ahead, you're going to have this same choice, the same crossroads presented before you. And you're going to have to make a decision. And so we find that this Torah portion, it as well becomes that word of correction. It reminds us that there's things within our hearts that we need to deal with. Because so often we try to sweep it under the rug and cover it and act like it's not really there. We cleaned house, just not that area. Don't go look under there. Leave that alone. But yet we find that's exactly what Yahweh's doing, isn't it? He's taking the light of His Word and He's shining it right on the areas that we really didn't want Him messing with. He's going to the very locations and the very areas within our lives and in our hearts that we really don't want to let go. And because of that, it can make us uncomfortable. We can get offended. We can get mad because it's causing us to deal with our flesh. But I want to remind you that Proverbs chapter 3, verse 12, He tells us that for whom Yahweh loves, He chastens. He corrects. Well, I'm here to tell you, Yahweh must really love us. He must really love you and I, this group of people, because He sure is bringing forth some words that are correcting us. But if you'll remember that, He loves you, and that's why He's doing this, it's all about His love, that even though it hurts and it doesn't feel good, you're going to remember that the outcome is going to be better. The outcome is going to be worth the hurt. It's going to be worth the sacrifice. It's going to be worth the cutting away that we have to go through. And many of you that are listening, you're probably in the middle of a situation right now. You're probably going through some things that aren't feeling too good, aren't you? Well, the whole reason you're in these situations is because Yahweh's allowing you to be placed in such a situation to begin to circumcise that flesh, to get rid of those areas that we really haven't turned over to Him. And so if you'll keep that in mind, then you can become the type of people that when you get placed in that hard spot, when you get placed in between the rock and the hard place, when you're being squeezed and the heat's being turned up, you can actually say, bring it on. Because you know that Yahweh loves you and He's not going to put on you more than you can bear, and you're ready. Because you know that when you walk out of this, you're going to be walking a little straighter. You're going to be looking a little bit more like Him. And that's the whole goal, isn't it? Well, with that said, we're going to get started on this week's Torah portion. It's titled Shelach, lecha. And it covers Numbers chapter 13, verse 1 through chapter 15, verse 41. And I'm going to challenge you today. I'm going to just throw down the gauntlet, double dog dare you, to take what you hear in this Torah portion, to take these words, to take the message you heard last night, to take these words of correction that Yahweh's beginning to issue forth to His people, and instead of in one ear and out the other, instead of letting it bounce around a little bit and then echo right out and hit the wall, to actually let it sink in, to actually understand what he wants to reveal to this generation and to begin to apply it. Because I can promise you, if you'll do that, if you'll apply these words that he's beginning to instruct us, you're going to see some changes in your lives, and you're going to see some changes in your home and in your community, because that's what the word does. It brings change. Now, this particular Torah portion, if you haven't read it, we're going to just catch you up to speed. There's some very significant events that take place within it. In fact, it's one of those portions that you have to really stop and let it sink in what just took place after you read it. Because you have to realize this is actually, it's history. This actually happened. It's not just some fairy tale. It's not some fable. But this was dealing with the individuals and their lives. This was a life and death situation. And this Torah portion is probably one of the most sobering portions that are found within the Torah. Because there's something that takes place within this portion that really causes you to say, wow, Yahweh doesn't play, does he? Because you'll find that after delivering Israel out of Egypt with his mighty hand, after pouring out his judgments, the plagues upon Egypt, he brings Israel out, he redeems them by the blood of the Lamb, and then he brings them into the wilderness. And that's where we've been this whole throughout the Torah. We've been in the wilderness now. They've been journeying. And we find that he parts the Red Sea. He pours manna from heaven out for them. He gives them water to drink. He provides for them. And then he brings them to Sinai. And at Sinai, they have this undescribable experience where Yahweh himself comes down upon the mountain. He speaks to the children of Israel. He gives them his Torah, literally their wedding covenant. And now we find that we've come to the climax of the story. We've come to the climax of this journey in this Torah portion because it's time to go and take the land. It's time to actually see what they've heard about the whole time they were in bondage in Egypt. When Moshe comes to get them and they remember that Abraham was promised this land, it's now time to actually go and take it. And yet we find that in this portion, 12 spies are sent into the land, and what do? 10 of them bring back a bad or evil report. But the real problem comes in that the people of Israel choose to accept that bad report. You see, they were given two options. They were given the report of Joshua and Caleb, the truth, that they could take the land, that they could do anything because Yahweh was for them, but then they're given the report of the other 10. And with herd mentality, they race towards that bad report. And because of their acceptance of that bad report, we find that there's a death sentence that's declared upon an entire generation. Everyone 20 years old and up is going to die now in this wilderness because of what they just did in this Torah portion. And so whenever you read that, it really is something that makes us stop and say, wow, Yahweh means business, doesn't he? But it also causes us to remember, what exactly are we listening to? They were given two reports. Which report will you believe? And so as a people, he's reminding us, you're going to be put into these same situations. You're going to be given two reports. You're going to be put in a situation where you're going to have to choose what you're going to listen to. And what you listen to determines life or death for you. And it's interesting that it takes 40 years. You may not see the results right off. Sometimes we don't see the results of what we say and what we listen to immediately in our lives. But I can promise you, it will catch up. And this generation finds that out. And so we find that for 40 years they're sentenced to wander until that younger generation would be raised up in their stead, a generation that would take back the land. And if you've ever read some of what the sages teach about this, it's really interesting because they say that that generation every evening, when it came time to go to bed, that they would go and they would dig their grave. And everyone would get and lie in their grave. And in the morning, some people would get up and some wouldn't. And those that got up would go and cover the graves of the others. And what really struck me with that is that this whole time that they've been in the wilderness, have they ever listened or believed what Yahweh told them? Every single time, they really didn't believe that he was going to do what he'd said. They always complained, they always showed disbelief, but finally it sinks in when he makes this declaration. They finally realize that they can't play with him anymore. They finally realize that he actually means business. And so this is really the lesson for you and I, that we don't have to get to this point. We don't have to wait till it's too late and we're declared that we're going to be cut off, because the lesson's right here. He's reminding you to be careful of what you hear. And so one of the questions that really came to my mind as I began to look and delve into this Torah portion is, With all the mess-ups that have been happening prior to their incursion into the land, now realize, when Moses goes to Egypt, they don't want to go. They complain when their workload gets doubled. He finally leads them out of Egypt. He brings them to the Red Sea. The first thing they do, they complain. They think they're going to be killed. They don't think Yahweh can deliver them. They get past the Red Sea, they complain. They get to Marah, the water's bitter, they can't drink it, they complain. They complain because they're hungry. They complain because they don't want to eat what he gives them. At Mount Sinai, when they should have been entering into the wedding covenant, literally this intimate experience with Yahweh, they build a golden calf instead. And they have an intimate encounter with him, another God. But yet through all of these situations, they rebel against Moses, they rebel against the Levitical priesthood, they attempt to usurp the authority. Through all of this, they can still go into the land. Through all of this, they still have hope, they still have a chance. So what's so significant about this event with these spies that finally causes Yahweh to say, no, you're not going in? Was it just the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back? Had he finally had enough? Was it the cutting off point in Yahweh's eyes? Or is there something more to what's taking place? Because in the English, it only seems like they're just scared. It seems like they're fearful, that they don't think they can conquer the land because there's giants in the land. Because there's a lot of strongholds that are in the land and they don't think they're strong enough, is what it seems like in the English. But you'll find, obviously, there's something more to it. Because all the previous times when they complained, Yahweh still let them get off, didn't he? And yet we find here there's this cutting off point. And so it causes us to ask the question, is their complaining in their report an indicator of something more? Exactly what were they saying and what were they rejecting? Well, let's turn, if you will, to Numbers chapter 13, verse 1 through verse 3. And we're going to take a look at this command to send the spies into the land. Shelach, lecha. Send for yourself. In Numbers 13, verse 1, it says, And Yahweh spoke unto Moshe, saying, Send thou men, that they may search the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel. Of every tribe of their fathers shall you send a man, every one a ruler among them. And Moshe, by the commandment of Yahweh, sent them from the wilderness of Paran. All those men were heads of the children of Israel. And you'll find that it then goes on to list every single individual, the name of those 12 spies. And now, if you've ever begun to study the Hebrew language, you know that these names are significant. He doesn't just randomly drop them here. He could have told you he sends a spy from every tribe, but he chooses to name them. And so before we close tonight, we're actually going to look at some of these names, and you're going to see the shadow picture that's being presented before us. But right now, we're going to look at this command to send these spies. Send thou men into the land. In Hebrew, this verse, verse 2, it reads, Shelach lecha anashim ve'yataru et eretz. Canaan, Asher, Ani noten, Libnei, Yisrael, Ish Akkad. Notice the repetition. Le matei avotain tishlaku kol nasim bahem. Now we're going to begin to break this down because you can never understand what's really happening unless you take it back to the Hebrew language. What I want to call your attention to is that in this verse, there's 22 words and there's 77 letters. Now both of these numbers are significant. And whenever you see something like this, Yahweh has placed every single letter there for a reason. Nothing should be taken for granted. So we need to look at these two numbers, and you'll find that as we begin to break this down and we delve into these numbers, he's actually going to reveal the grievous sin that's being committed right here as these spies are sent into the land, and what you and I don't want to fall in the same category of. The number 22, anytime you see it, immediately it points us to the Hebrew Aleph Bet, because there are 22 letters in his language. Now, for some of you, if you're new and you're just now coming into the Hebrew roots, maybe you really don't understand the significance and the power that can be found in his language. We're told in Genesis that Yahweh spoke everything into existence. He spoke creation into being. That's the power that can be found in the spoken word, especially his language, because he created it just for that. And whenever you're dealing with the language, you can't separate the Hebrew language from the Torah. They're one and the same. And you can't separate the Torah from the Messiah, because he was the Word made flesh. So literally, we could make the statement that the Messiah was the living Aleph Bet. He was the Aleph Bet made flesh. So in other words, how we respond to learning his language is a factor in how we're responding to keeping the Torah. It's a factor in how we're treating him. See, all of these things, they all go together. And so how we treat it determines how we're treating the other as well. Well, whenever you see this number 22, it's reminding us of the language of the Aleph Beit. And his language, it's literally representing who he is, the essence of Yahweh. It's his DNA. It's who he is. You can't separate the two from each other. And so when we see that these spies are being sent into the land, this particular verse has 22 words, and he's beginning to connect some things for us of what it means to enter into the land. We find that as they prepare to go and take their inheritance, that's what's taking place in the physical. Physically, their inheritance was the land of Israel. But he's reminding them that there's also a spiritual inheritance as well. Because anytime you see something happening in the physical, there's something going on in the spiritual as well. Well, we find that there's a restoration spiritually as well. A revealing and a restoration of the language of Yahweh is about to take place as they go into the land. And whenever this language, this Torah, the power that's inherent in it, whenever it begins to be restored to the children of Israel, he's reminding that it's literally going to cause their bodies that have been corrupted, that have been defective, to be restored, because he's about to encode them with his own DNA. He's about to put his word within them in such a fashion that they'll be like Adam in the garden again. They'll be walking in that kind of authority, that kind of power, and that kind of relationship with him. After all, remember, they're going into the promised land. Well, what's the word promised in Hebrew? It's the term dabar. It's the same word for word. He's literally sending them into his word. And we find that he's about to reveal and encode them again with his language, his DNA. And so this is what's at stake. This is what's taking place here as they prepare to enter into the land. This is what he's offering the children of Israel. Yet when we look at this number 22, we find that it's also connected in the scriptures to two of the worst kings in the history of Israel. Because King Ahab and King Jeroboam each reigned for 22 years. Now that may seem like a little trivial fact, but whenever you see these numbers, they're significant. They're important. So we need to take a look at these two individuals, and I believe you'll begin to see that what they did is exactly what Israel does in this Torah portion. First, let's look at the name Jeroboam. In Hebrew, it's Strong's number 3379, Yerab-am, and his name is translated as meaning the people will contend. It comes from the root meaning to strive, to contend, to make a complaint. It's starting to sound like the reaction of Israel, isn't it? When presented with this opportunity, what do? They complain. They contend. They strive amongst each other. And it's also interesting because Jeroboam, it's under his reign that the kingdom splits. He takes the 10 northern tribes and creates the kingdom of Israel, and we find the other two become the kingdom of Judah. Well, here in this Torah portion, isn't there a split as well? We have 10 spies coming back with an evil report. Coming back, choosing to complain, to strive, to not want to take the land, and we find that the other two are the exact opposite. Well, let's look at Ahab. King Ahab ruled 22 years as well. Ahab in Hebrew is Akav, Strong's number 256. It's translated as meaning father's brother. But yet you'll find the root of his name, it's the word Ak, the Aleph and the Ket, and it can mean brother, but there's a few other words as well that are spelled with these same two letters. And because of what this individual does, it really seems that these other words are much more fitting to describe who he is. Because the Aleph Ket can also form the word woe, alas. It's an exclamation of grief. It's connected to the root, which can mean to cry or to howl. So in other words, Ahab, his name literally can mean one who cries and howls in grief before the Father. And the value of his name, he has a numerical value of 12, just like the 12 spies that are being sent into the land right now. So can you begin to see what's taking place within these names? It seems as if he's declaring exactly what happens in this Torah portion. We have the 12 being sent into the land, and they're about to have restored to them their inheritance. He's taking them into his word, into his dabar, and they're about to have a divine encounter with the one that it represents. And yet we find there's a split that happens among the people. 10 instead choose to complain. They choose to strive and contend, and because of that we find that the congregation, the people, the nation, will cry and howl before Yahweh because they reject their inheritance. Now, whenever you look at Ahab, if you remember the story of Ahab, you know that you really can't look at Ahab without looking at who his queen was. She was probably one of the most prominent queens in Israel, but not in the good way. Ahab was married to a woman named Jezebel. Jezebel in Hebrew, it's translated as meaning Baal exalts, or Baal is husband too. But yet her name as well, you can break it down and you'll see some more meaning within it. Her name is spelled with the Aleph, the Yod, the Zayin, the Beit, and the Lamed. The Ayin Yod means not, no. It's negative. Then you have the Zayin, the Beit, and the Lamed, and it's the same root that you can see in the name Zebulon. It means to exalt, to honor. But it can also mean habitation, an exalted dwelling place. So when you see this name Jezebel, her name can literally translate as one who rejects the exalted dwelling place. Well, here, what's that exalted dwelling place? It's the promised land. It's what Israel's being offered. Well, now we also understand that land, it's synonymous with his word. It's the Debar land. It's the word land. So not only is she one that rejects the exalted dwelling place, she's one that rejects the word. She's one that rejects the language as well. He's beginning to give us some characteristics of the two type of individuals that we see in the camp. We see those that will be the bride, those that will accept the exalted dwelling place, his word, their covenant, his language, and those that will be Jezebel, those that will play the harlot, those that will reject it. These two individuals, Ahab and Jezebel, they were the arch enemies of the prophet Elijah. We need to look at him as well, because you're going to see how all of this connects together, and we see these same things being played out in this Torah portion. Isn't it amazing how it's the same pattern again and again? And it's all for this generation, because this same pattern will be played out again in the days that you and I live in. But he's given you these patterns so that you can understand and actually make the right decisions. The prophet Elijah, his name is translated as my God is Yahweh. But he has a numerical value with his name of 46. Well, 46 is another prominent number. And if you've ever taken biology or anatomy, maybe you remember that you have 46 chromosomes. 46 chromosomes organize your DNA. Your DNA is who you are. It's the essence of who you are. Well, if you look at the term chromosomes, and you trace the roots of this word, because our English language came from somewhere else. So you can trace these words that we have, and you can take it all the way back to the Hebrew. Well, the term chromosomes, it comes from the Greek word chromo, which comes from the Hebrew term karam. And it means a covering, to spread over, to spread or lay something over. But the only time it's used is in Ezekiel chapter 37. And it's dealing with the valley of dry bones. In Ezekiel 37, verse 6 through 8, he describes the skin that would cover, karam, the dry bones. It says, and I will lay sinews upon you, and I will bring up flesh upon you, and cover, karam, you with skin, and put breath in you, and ye shall live, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. And so whenever you're looking at Ahab, Jezebel, and Elijah, that was Elijah's ministry. He was speaking to the dry bones. He was speaking to the individuals that had rejected their inheritance, and because that they were a valley of dry bones, and he was reminding them that Yahweh had a covering for them. Yahweh had an inheritance that was waiting upon them, but yet we find the rulers of Israel, Ahab and Jezebel, rejected. They're ones that reject that habitation. They reject the word. Well, isn't that exactly what's taking place in this Torah portion? We find that the people howl and complain in grief before the Father, because they choose to contend, to strive, and to complain. They reject the promised land. They reject the exalted dwelling place. And when they do that, they indicate and mark themselves as one that's like Jezebel. One that declares Baal is my husband, because they reject the house of the Messiah. And we find that when they do that, when they reject the land, that spiritually they had just rejected the Torah as well. They had rejected the word, the Debar. They had rejected the repairing of their DNA. They chose to stay in their polluted condition instead. So instead of the dry bones being covered by this covering that he was offering them, we find they remain spiritually dead and they have no breath within them. Spiritually, that takes place right here when they choose to reject entering into the promised land. And we find that it manifests itself in the physical as well. It takes 40 years, but it manifests in the physical because that entire generation perishes. They become the valley of dry bones because they rejected the covering. They rejected entering into the land. We find that ultimately they rejected the one that would give them life, the Messiah. Well, do you realize that the same choice is being presented before you and I today as well? Yahweh is watching how we respond to his debar as well. It's the same thing. The spies, when they're sent into the land, the spiritual significance was that they were exploring the debar. They were exploring the word. But we find that in today, he's also revealing his debar again. He's unveiling his language, his word. You're being given a choice to once again be restored to your inheritance. Yet when we allow our flesh to get in the way and we choose to walk after it instead of after the Spirit, we find that we're indicating and marking ourselves that we're one that's like Jezebel. We're one that will play the harlot instead of the bride. Now can you see how significant it is when you come and you begin to hear his word and you hear his language? The way you respond determines whether you're part of the bride or whether you're part of Jezebel, one that will declare Baal is my husband instead. Let's look at this number 77, because there was 22 words, which is teaching us and reminding us that it's not just the physical land that's at stake here. Their spiritual inheritance is being dealt with as well. He's restoring his language. He's restoring his word. He's attempting to cover his people, and yet we find that they choose to reject this. Let's look at the number 77, though. There's 77 letters in this particular verse. The number 77 is the value of the phrase or the word bimhal, and it means in circumcision. It comes from the root mahal, which means to circumcise and to cut down. So we find that the way you respond to your inheritance, whether you're one that's willing to take it, to cover yourself with it, to allow it to cover you, determines whether your generation is circumcised. It determines whether you're a generation that's cut off or not. And if you look at that term to circumcise, mahal, it has the letter mem, which means the origin, the source of, to come from or out of, and then it's connected to the hey lamed. The hey lamed is the root meaning praise. From this generation being cut off would issue forth the praises of Yahweh. In other words, he was dealing with the generation that refused to praise him. They chose to complain. They chose to strive, to always issue evil words from their mouth. And we find that when that generation's cut off, Yahweh's praises would finally issue forth. Do you realize that if some people in the body today started falling down for no reason, and all of a sudden there's a lot less sitting in here, how quickly a revival would break out? Because people would begin to realize Yahweh's not playing, and they would realize how significant it is to praise him and to be careful of the words that are issuing forth from our mouths. Because they will mark you as either Jezebel, Baal is my husband, or it will mark you as the bride. Well, that number 77, it's also the value of the term Migdal, and it means tower. Well, the first time you see Migdal, the first time you see a tower, it's in Genesis chapter 11, verse 5, and it's the Tower of Babel. Go figure, where the language was removed, where the language was confused and confounded. It says, and Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower, the Migdal, which the children of men builded. And Yahweh said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. So when you see this first verse here, Numbers chapter 13, verse 2, and you look at the number of letters and the number of words, we have 22 and we have 77. 22 immediately connects us to the language of Yahweh. 77 connects us to the Tower of Babel. And so we find that he's revealing to us this expedition has a lot more to do than just the physical piece of land. This expedition was an opportunity to have restored what had been lost at Babel. And yet we find that Israel rejects it. Specifically, the 10 spies are the ones that reject it. Doesn't that sound like the 10 northern tribes that also despised their inheritance? Hence the reason we've been scattered. Hence the reason we no longer know who we are, and we've been scattered to the four corners of the earth because we rejected our inheritance. And yet we find now this valley of dry bones that has had no breath within them, all of a sudden the Ruach's beginning to blow again, isn't he? And he's beginning to reveal to you that he's about to cover you. He's restoring your understanding of the Torah. He's bringing you back to the Debar, back to the Word, and he's beginning to breathe his language into you again. And yet the pattern is that in the past we've rejected it. And we find that Israel here, they reject it because how many of you realize the more Debar, the more word that you put in, it means you have to make room for it. It can't just come into a vessel that's been filled with all the other junk of Egypt. And so we find that as a people, we've been filled with all this other stuff, all these other words, these evil reports that we've been listening to. And so whenever we hear the Debar, it's going to have to cut some of that out, which means it's going to hurt, which means we have to circumcise our hearts. And this is the reason that Israel doesn't want to do it. They don't want to circumcise their hearts. They're not willing to let go of all that junk from Egypt, and so they reject their inheritance. And yet here we are, we stand at the same crossroads, don't we? You're hearing the Debar, you're hearing the word, and yet it's going to require some cutting away. And so we have a choice to make. Are we going to circumcise our hearts and be the generation that goes into the land, or are we going to be those that are circumcised ourselves, where we're cut off from Israel, so that Yahweh's praises could finally issue forth? Well, we find that this is the significance of this particular expedition into the land. This is why it's so important. This is why their rejection of the land finally makes Yahweh declare that they'll be cut off. We find that these numbers 22 and 77, if you break them down, they both are a factor of the number of 11. 22 is 11 times 2, and 77 is 11 times 7. So our focus is placed on that number 11. So we have 2, 7, and 11. And unless you begin to realize these numbers are significant, this is something that we'll just skip right over. But he's revealing to you why it's so important about this expedition within these numbers. The number 2 is the number that's associated with the letter Beit. It represents the house, the family, the bride. The number 7 is the value of the letter Zion. And the Zion is the weapon. It's the weapon, it means to cut off. But it's also associated, this number 7, it's associated with covenant, completion, perfection. You realize that when you walk in covenant, that's what allows you to be perfect in His eyes. It's because you're walking in covenant. He's completing you. He's making you, whatever's been missing, He now has that missing piece reattached. The number 11 is the number that's associated with disorder, disorganization, imperfection, and disintegration. And so we find that this journey was about the house, the family, His bride, being given an opportunity to finally truly walk in covenant. This was her point in time to make that choice, to allow Him to complete and perfect them by allowing their hearts to be circumcised. In other words, to take that Zion, to take the sword of His word and allow the flesh to be cut off. Or they could choose to continue to walk in imperfection, to allow the flesh to rule along with disorder, disorganization, and disintegration in the camp. Well, this same opportunity is being presented to you and I today as well. You realize that the Word is being revealed at such a rate that hasn't been seen since the Messiah has walked the earth. He's revealing things that have been hidden within His Word for this end generation. And we find that how we're willing to spy it out, to search it out, how we accept it or reject it determines whether we're cut off or whether we're one that enters in. Isn't that a very sobering thought? Because how have we responded to it in the past? How often when someone's up here sharing do we get that glazed over look in our eyes? Or we start fidgeting, we start moving around. I got to go get some water. I got to go get some coffee. I got to go to the bathroom. I've got to do something because as it's being put in, it's beginning to cut away some other stuff, isn't it? And it doesn't always feel good. It's not that touchy good feeling. It's not that tickling behind the ears because that's not what Yahweh's in the business of. We find that Yahweh's in the business of raising up a generation that's capable of taking back the land. There's giants in the land. That means you're going to have to know how to wield your sword. You're going to have to be dealing with some supernatural enemies, and you're going to have to be an individual that has the Word within you, because it's only the Debar that allow you to stand in the days ahead. That's why the title of this Torah portion, Shelach, Lecha, That phrase lecha literally means for your own benefit, for yourself. It's for your good that you begin to explore the debar, that you understand and you send those that'll search it out. Let's look at this word for send. In Hebrew, it's shelach. Strong's number 7971. It means to send away, to let go, to stretch out. But it can also mean to dismiss, to cast out, to be impelled, or to be divorced. If you break this word apart, you'll find that it has the shin lamed as the two-letter root. The shin lamed forms the word Saul, and it means a grievous sin that's worthy of death. And it's specifically used in reference to the individual Uzzah who mishandled the ark. When the ark was being transported, it began to wobble on the cart, and he reaches out and he touches it, and the word that's used there to describe that grievous sin is this shin lamed, the term Saul. He mishandles Yahweh. He mishandles the Ark of the Covenant. In this word shelach, this root is connected with the letter ket. The letter ket has a value of 8. 8 means new beginnings. But in Hebrew, this letter ket, it's also the picture of a wall. And in the Paleo, it's the picture of a ladder specifically. Well, whenever you see or hear the term ladder, it reminds us of Jacob, because Jacob was shown a ladder, wasn't he? In the book of Genesis, Jacob has a dream at the place known as Bethel, and Yahweh shows him a ladder that stretches from heaven to earth. And that ladder, when you begin to study what was taking place, Yahweh was actually showing him his DNA, his language, the Torah. And he was making a promise to Jacob that if you'll be obedient, if you'll walk in covenant with me, I'm going to change your DNA. I'm going to change your seed. You're going to be the generation that will house my word, my seed, instead of the defective, genetically modified stuff that you've been housing before. He was going to purify the line of Jacob. So whenever we see this term shelach, send for yourself, send these spies into the land, he's telling them that for your best interest, for your benefit, dismiss, cast out, and be divorced from those grievous sins that you've been involved in. Those sins that are worthy of death. In other words, before they ever enter into the land, before they ever bring back their evil report, he was already reminding them, don't mishandle me. Don't mishandle Yahweh. Don't trifle with him. Don't approach uncircumcised. And we find that if they would do that, if they would actually approach him the way they were supposed to, the way that they had been taught this whole time they've been at Sinai, he was teaching them how to handle him. He was teaching them how to approach him. That's why they built the Mishkan, the tabernacle, teaching them, this is the way you approach Yahweh. This is how you handle me. He's not to be trifled with like the gods of Egypt. And we find these spies, he's reminding them before they ever go in, don't mishandle me. And if they would have handled him correctly, we find that by removing themselves from their previous ways, by circumcising their hearts, he was promising them that they could have a new beginning. That literally he would change their DNA. He would implant within them his word, his language, and it would change their nature. It would complete them. In other words, they didn't have to continue on in the same rut that they've been in the past. And the same goes for you and I. If you're in a situation where you're not happy, where things aren't going the way they could be going, where everything's not 100% perfect, he's reminding you all you have to do is begin to put his debar in, and it's going to affect change. He'll complete you. You don't have to go through the same thing generation after generation, but there's a promise of a new beginning. Amen? Some of you may like what you've got. It doesn't sound like that's too enthusiastic. Amen? Well, let's look at the word men. He says, send for yourself men. Well, in Hebrew, there are several terms that can be used to describe men. There's the term Adam. It means man, mankind. There's the term Ish, which means man. But the word that he chooses to use here begins to reveal what the state of Israel is. He uses the word Enosh. It's Strong's number 582. It means man, mortal, person, or mankind. But it comes from the root anash, which means to be weak, sick, frail. The same word is used in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9. It says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Anash. Who can know it? And we find this is the description that he's applying to this group of men that are about to enter into the promised land. They're anash, they're weak, they're sick, they're frail. it doesn't really sound like the type of individuals you want representing you going into the land to face these giants, does it? And we find the key indicator here. Let's look and see. What did it mean that their hearts were wicked? That they were walking after the flesh? What was the key indicator that they were not handling Yahweh right? That they were attempting to approach Him uncircumcised? Was it just their complaining? Because if it was just their complaining, you and I are in a lot of trouble, aren't we? If it's just their complaining, that means that we've been mishandling Him a whole lot. And it's surprising that we're still here. But let's take a little closer look at this and see what exactly was His issue with the children of Israel here. Why are they cut off? Well, the term anash is also used in Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 12. It says, "For thus saith Yahweh, thy bruise is incurable, anash, and thy wound is grievous." Well, let's look at this term bruise, because it's the same word connecting us. Your heart is deceitful above all things, it's desperately wicked, anash. It's the root of this term for men here, and now he tells us that our bruise is incurable. The term bruise in Hebrew is shaber, and it means a breaking, a fracture, a crushing, a breach, a crash, a ruin, or a shattering, specifically the fracture of a wall. Well, that really doesn't help us out unless you understand the significance and the symbology behind the wall. In Songs of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 9, the statement is made, "I am a wall," and it was referring to the bride, the beloved woman. So we find the grievous sin that he's dealing with these men about, the children of Israel, is that there was a fracture in the wall. There was a rift. There was a breach. There was a fracture among the bride. A fracture among the believers. Well, remember that title, shelach, lecha? That word shelach, it was spelled with the sheen, the lamed, and the letter ket. The sheen lamed meant the grievous sin. The letter ket is the picture of a wall, a fence. There's a grievous sin concerning the wall. In other words, the reason they'd been mishandling Yahweh, the reason they had been mishandling the ark, was because they had a fracture among themselves. They weren't walking in unity. And so we find that if you're going to handle Yahweh correctly, if you're going to be one that walks in covenant, one that has a circumcised heart, part of that requires the fractures to be mended among the believers. Well, isn't that interesting? Because isn't that the key that's really been missing among the Hebrew roots community? Unity. We talk about it all the time. Let's get together. Let's be unified. Let's come together. This one new man. And yet you and I can't even fellowship with each other because so often we get mad. We get aggravated. You get on my nerves. You do things that aggravate me, that make me mad. And so the unity becomes fractured. The wall becomes broken. Well, notice that in that opening verse, the phrase ish akkad was repeated. In Hebrew, that means one man. Send one man. One man. In other words, he was revealing to them before they ever went into the promised land, send a unified man. Send a body into the land, not a fractured wall. Well, do you realize that when we have problems with each other then, and we refuse to deal with it, and we keep that anger and that hurt, and we allow the flesh to begin to dictate how we're going to handle these situations, and then we come into the house of Yahweh, that you're mishandling Him? And that's the sin that the Israelites committed. They choose to have a fractured wall. They choose to be those that would complain and strive and contend, and because of that, they mishandled Yahweh. Well, could this then be the reason that we're still in the same position today? Things haven't really changed too much, have they? We're still in this same rut. We find that we're coming back to Torah, we're attempting to walk in covenant, and many are even realizing the power in the Hebrew language, yet there's still a disconnect, isn't it? Are we walking in the power and the authority that it seems that was promised to Abraham, that was promised to the children of Israel? Those that would be the head and not the tail, those that would be blessed coming in and going out. Well, if this is what it looks to be blessed, it's no wonder that no one's breaking down the doors. And see, we find that the disconnect becomes we are failing to walk in the authority that is promised us because we're failing to walk in unity as well. And so it seems that no matter how much we try to attempt to walk in Torah, if we fail to love one another, then we're failing to handle Him correctly. It's not a coincidence the term yachad, the word union, unitedness, together. In Amos chapter 3, verse 3, it says, "Can two walk together? Can they walk yachad, except they be agreed?" Well, it has a value of 22. pointing us right back to this particular Torah portion, to these 22 words in this verse, pointing us back to the language, to their inheritance, what they were attempting to go and take, yet they weren't walking yachad. They weren't in unity, and because of that, they mishandled and they trifled with Yahweh. Now let's go and look at Numbers again. We find the spies, they're sent forth from Paran. That's significant as well, because every last word within these verses right here, each one is teaching the spies how they should go into the land, how they should come before Yahweh, how they should handle him lest they be cut off. The word Paran is Strong's number 6290. It's translated as meaning the place of caverns, but if you break it down, the three-letter root is the Aleph, the Resh, and the Nun. It translates as Aran, and it means ark, referring to the Ark of the Covenant. Remember, the grievous sin was they mishandled the Ark? Well, here you have where they're being sent from, the root is ark, reminding them don't mishandle the Ark. At the beginning of this term, Paran, attached to that root is the letter Pei. It represents the mouth. And so we find that before they ever leave, before they ever go into the land and bring back their evil report, he was reminding them that their mouth would be like the ark. And just as the ark contained the manna, the tablets of stone, Aaron's rod representing the authority, so should the words of their mouth when they came back. They should be speaking forth the debar. They should be speaking forth the word in the same authority that it was meant to be. Hence the grievous sin when they bring back an evil report. They mishandled the ark. They chose to cause a grievous sin among the children of Israel. The value of this term Paran, it equals 331. It's the same as Ephraim. His name can either mean a double ash heap or I shall be doubly fruitful. And it's interesting because this name, there's a curse meaning and there's a blessed side as well. And he was reminding the children of Israel that the words that you choose to speak forth when you come back from the Debar land, when you bring your report back, what you choose to speak forth is going to seal your fate. Because it was either going to reveal that they had been chosen to be a unified people, that they had become Ish Akkad, literally that they were becoming that one new man, with the repaired DNA, a changed nature, a circumcised heart, and they would then be doubly fruitful. Or their words would bring strife, division, complaining, and it would indicate their rejection to circumcise their hearts, and instead they would become a double ash heap. And that's exactly what that generation does. They're cut off. They become that ash heap. What is their response when Yahweh shows them the land? Because their response is quite telling of why this generation is cut off. In Numbers chapter 14, verse 3, this is the way they respond when Yahweh attempts to bring them into the land. It says, "And wherefore hath Yahweh brought us into this land? To fall by the sword? That our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return into Egypt?" Well, they've made that statement quite a lot. They always want to go back to Egypt. But yet here they've added to it that our wives and our children should be a prey. The word prey is Strong's number 957. It's the term baz, and it means a spoil, a robbery, spoiling. But here it's written with the lamed prefix. Lamed beit Zion, labaz. Well, the lamed beit forms the word lev. It means the heart. And it's connected upon the end with that letter Zion. Well, the letter Zion, we already looked at, it means the weapon, the sword, that which will circumcise you, that which cuts. So in other words, when you see this term right here in this question, what they were really saying, the statement that was being made was that, did Yahweh bring us out here to circumcise our hearts? Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? And we find that those same letters that form labaz, if you rearrange them, they form zabal, the root, which meant an exalted dwelling place. In other words, they reject their inheritance, they reject the land, they reject the exalted dwelling place because they didn't want to circumcise their hearts. And this is the reason the entire generation gets cut off. They're not willing to circumcise their hearts, so Yahweh circumcises them instead. And this term labaz, you'll find that it's a cognate of bazat. It's the same root, that beit Zion. It's Strong's number 959, and it means to despise, to hold in contempt, to disdain. And it's specifically used to describe one that would despise their birthright, one that would despise their inheritance like Esau did. That's why Esau was hated by Yahweh. He despised his birthright. He despised his inheritance. And so we find that they would become a house. That two-letter root is the bait and the zion. The bait represents the house, and the zion represents the sword. So it reveals to us they would become a house that would be cut off by the sword because they despised their inheritance. They despised the debar. They despised the word. They weren't willing to allow it to circumcise their hearts to make room for it within them. So instead, they're cut off. A generation that would despise the word of Yahweh. And we're told the results of this in Numbers chapter 14, verse 29. This is Yahweh's response to their question. Did you bring us out here to circumcise our hearts? Was this the whole point, to come out here and deal with our flesh before we entered into the land? His response is that your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness, all that were numbered of you, according to your whole number, from 20 years old and upward, which have murmured against me. Well, that word carcasses is pager, and it means a corpse, a carcass. But it's spelled with the letter pei, gamel, and the letter resh. The letter pei represents the mouth, the language, his word. The letter gamel and the letter resh forms the word stranger, a foreigner. And so we find the whole time they're at Sinai, the whole time they're building the tabernacle and preparing to go into the land, when they're in the midbar, literally the place where the word is being spoken forth, they remained a stranger to what was issuing forth from the mouth of Yahweh. They remained a stranger to his language, and they chose to despise it instead. And because of that, they're denied access. Because of that, they're cut off, they're circumcised from the nation of Israel. Well, how many of you realize that no matter how much head knowledge we have of Torah, no matter how much we study, no matter how much we put in, that if it's not affecting our walk, that if it's not affecting the way we handle ourselves, if it's not affecting our nature, you're one that's despising your birthright. You're one that's despising your inheritance. And in Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9, we're told that, "For then will I turn to the people a pure language. They may all call upon the name of Yahweh to serve him with one consent." This is a verse that's being fulfilled in the days that you and I live in. He's restoring the understanding of his language. It's coming alive again. And we find the reason he tells us is so that you can serve him with one consent. In other words, he's once again connecting the fact that the reason he's revealing his debar to you, the reason he's placing this within you, is so that you can serve him with one consent, so that you can dwell in unity, so that you can come together so you won't mishandle the ark. And we find this is what becomes the core lesson of this Torah portion. The generation that chose to strive and complain instead of joining together in unity are cut off from their inheritance because they despised it. They rejected his language. They rejected the debar. And we find that our generation as well faces these same decisions. He promises to restore his language again, literally to restore your inheritance. And whenever he restores your inheritance, it's going to change your very DNA. He's going to restore who you are. But it will require us as well to circumcise our hearts, to join together in unity. Because you realize that as long as we're holding on and letting our flesh rule, you're always going to be easily offended. You're always going to be easily angered. You're always going to get upset. And you're always going to want things your way. So it's only when we circumcise our hearts and deal with it that we can actually dwell in unity. And it's only when we dwell in unity that we can actually be an individual that's not despising our birthright. And so far, if we're quite honest with ourselves, as a body worldwide, we've made really low marks in unity, haven't we? We've been characterized as a group that complains, a group of disorder, disorganization, and disunity. And yet we find the message of this Torah portion reminds us the significance of allowing Yahweh to change all that. The significance of being a group that would allow our hearts to be circumcised. Because if not, the generation gets cut off and another one is raised up in their stead. Now as we get ready to close, let's take a real quick look at these names of these individuals that brought back that evil report. There was Shemua of Reuben. His name means renowned, but it's from the root which means disheartened, dismayed. Shaphat of Simeon. His name means to judge, to enter into controversy. Igal of Issachar. It can be translated as he redeems, but it also comes from the root which can mean avenge, to take revenge. Palti of Benjamin. It means to escape, to slip away. Gadiel of Zebulon. It means fortune is my God. Gadai of Manasseh, my fortune. Amiel of Dan, it means the people of Elohim. Sethur of Asher, it means hidden, to hide oneself carefully. Nabi of Naphtali, it means hidden, to withdraw oneself. And Guel of Gad means to lift or exalt oneself. These were the 10 that brought back the evil report. And so we find that the people of Elohim, Amiel of Dan, the people of Elohim were being represented by characteristics such as easily disheartened, dismayed, quick to enter into controversy and to judge, those who seek revenge, those that are quick to escape and to slip away, those who would claim fortune as their God, those who withdraw and hide themselves from being searched out by Yahweh, choosing instead to exalt and lift up oneself. And because of that, the entire generation is cut off. Well, how many realize these same characteristics can just be applied just as easily to the body today? We've been characterized by these same traits as well. And yet we find this Torah portion reminds you that you're given an opportunity to circumcise your hearts. We're being given an opportunity body-wide to deal with these things before we get to that crossroads, so that we can make the right decision, so that we can learn to walk in unity together and become the one new man. The whole purpose of why Messiah came to make of the two one. And we find that we're being given the choice now to actually fulfill that. And hopefully, the majority will be able to answer just like Joshua did, that as for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh. That means no matter the cost, no matter the hurt, no matter what has to be cut away, we're going to serve Yahweh. Amen? Thank you for listening. We hope that you have enjoyed this Torah portion. Shabbat Shalom.